Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the Trump world order.
The golden age of America begins right now.
What is the world he's inheriting, and where could he take it? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take.
He was talking about how the United States is going to be number one. He didn't necessarily use the word dominant, but if you read between the lines, it very much sounded as if he wanted to make the United States the very dominant global power again, essentially reestablishing American unipolarity rather than adjusting to the world becoming increasingly multipolar. I am Trita Parsi. I'm the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute, a think tank in Washington, focused on foreign policy, and I am right outside of Washington in Northern Virginia.
Well, Trita, welcome to The Take. Trita, you're in the D.C. area where it snowed overnight. I think it's currently below 0 Celsius. That's why Donald Trump's inauguration today was indoors rather than on the steps of the Capitol as it normally is. So what was the vibe like around D.C. today as the city prepares for another 4 years of Donald Trump?
I have to say, it's really stunningly different from what it was in 2016 when Trump won the first time. And the country, and particularly Washington, D.C., as you know, it's a very democratic city, was utterly stunned. There was organizing of the resistance immediately after his victory with the Million Women's March, etc. All of these different things happened, and there was a sense of desire to fight back. This time around, I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing a lot of despair in the sense of just giving up, essentially trying to wait it out for 4 years. I'm seeing a sense in which people are not taking it seriously what the democratic message was, that this is going to be a massive threat to American democracy. Not in the sense that they're belittling many of the dangerous things that they think Trump will do, but because I think they are just stunned by the horrible performance of the Democrats themselves. So they're not clinging on to something else to fight Trump with, because there isn't that something else this time around, at least not something else that they think is worthy of clinging on to. That's the sense I'm getting, because it's just stunningly different from what it was in 2017, 2016.
Yeah. Most people have an under-promise and over-deliver approach, not Trump. He says everything's going to be great starting now. I know he's planning to sign a slew of executive orders within the first day. Are you personally ready for the golden age of America to start?
But it is interesting, though, because what he's trying to do is to just generate a degree of excitement and hope and positivity that by and large had been lost. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Whether he can do it and whether he can deliver on it, of course, is tremendously different things. But I think this is very starkly different from what the Biden administration tried to do. They certainly did try to underpromise, and they try to be very cautious. I don't think that's the root reason as to why ultimately, at least their foreign policy was a failure and why they lost the election. It's just a different style. But I think there's a natural tendency amongst people to not necessarily take everything Trump says literally. They understand that there is a tremendous amount of fluff around it. But I think there is at the same time a recognition that there had a situation of stagnation and almost impossibility of being able to move things had emerged over the course of the last couple of decades. What is politically feasible has become very limited. And in that sense, precisely because Trump does not seem to, even understand the concept of political capital, does not seem to care about political limitations, there's a disruptiveness to him that I think to a certain extent, even those who oppose Trump nevertheless see as potentially useful, because things had become so stagnated and so cemented, almost nothing could be done.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the substance. Your background is foreign policy. In his speech, Trump talked about being a unifier overseas, referencing specifically the recent ceasefire between Hamas and Israel.
I'm pleased to say that as of yesterday, one day before I assumed office, the hostages in the Middle East are coming back home to their families.
He said his proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker. Now, you work at the Quincy Institute, which is all about military restraint and diplomatic cooperation. Is this music to your ears?
I have to say, certainly the message itself is a very important and positive one. Now, whether he will be able to live up to it, whether he will be able to deliver, whether he actually will even try to live up to those specific principles that he's putting forward. So it's more than just rhetoric and nice speeches, remains to be seen. Then the very next passage, he's talking about taking back Panama, which certainly did not come across as the approach of a peacemaker or a unifier.
China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China. We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back.
But I think, nevertheless, the fact that he is saying these things, the fact that there is a conclusion in his circle, and perhaps at some point in the larger Republican Party, that is a winning message with the American people. That, this constant warmongering and talking about how strong we are and how we're going to destroy our enemies, etc., is not necessarily received positively by the American people because they're really tired of wars. And this is interestingly enough, someone with his track record, which is not necessarily particularly great in many different ways, nevertheless could take that spot precisely because the Democrats abandoned it. While Trump, during the campaign trail, said that he wanted the bloodletting and the killing in Gaza to end, a very simple, unobjectionable statement. Kamala Harris could not even muster to say something like that. Instead, she was bragging about how we're going to have the most lethal military force in the world. So you're seeing the two parties going in opposite direction of where they used to go, but with an added element of Trump going further than I can remember any president in terms of really embracing the idea of being a peacemaker. Even Obama, he said that he no longer wanted to have any dumb wars. And he said that he would pursue diplomacy. But he didn't go as far as to say, my most important legacy is that I'm going to be a peacemaker.
Yeah.
Really elevating that to a top value. Not even under Obama was something like that said.
Yeah, Trita, the line I think people will key in on is the wars we win, but most importantly, the wars we never get into.
Yeah. Which is crucial.
That sounds like it could be written by the Quincy Institute.
It certainly could have been. Because, again, it's extremely important. You have a foreign policy bureaucracy in Washington, the blob, so to say, a foreign policy establishment that really measures America's engagement in the world in terms of how many countries we're bombing. As you know, they tend to like to say that those who are on the restraint side, those like Quincy who want to see far less military engagement and far more diplomatic engagement, they call us isolationist simply because we don't want to bomb so many countries. That makes us isolation. Now, we want more diplomacy than they do. We want more trade than they do. But that doesn't count. What counts is how many countries are you bombing? Mm-hmm. And for him to come with these statements and talking about that the most important thing is the wars that we don't get into, recognizing that there's so many different countries, particularly U.S. allies, that are constantly trying to drag the United States into wars that benefit those countries at the expense of the United States. But they're essentially looking at the U.S. as some sort of a military for rent and want the United States to come in and fight their wars for them. And there's a recognition of that in what Trump is saying, the wars we don't get into, in a way that I don't think I've heard any recent president even speak of.
But isn't the blob, as you called it, going to fight back?
The blob will always try to fight back. It has a self-perpetuating interest in just continuing to be what it is. And they fought back last time with Trump in terms of things that he wanted to do, such as withdrawing from Syria and put up ferocious resistance to make sure that that didn't happen. And I'm sure they will do that this time around as well. But I think also it's important to recognize that Trump will also do things that the blob probably will like. A lot of different things that is not really in line with the true meaning of being a peacemaker. For instance, there's a high likelihood that he will continue to pursue the Abraham Accords, which is an effort to get Arab states to normalize relations with Israel in return for some American concessions, but virtually zero concessions from Israel and zero movement on a Palestinian state. In fact, the whole effort was to make sure that statehood for the Palestinians were more or less forgotten and the Palestinians were shoved under the rug. Many would argue that the October 7th attacks in some ways are a direct response to the Abraham Accord because it was trying to make the Palestinians irrelevant, and Hamas tried to refute that point. There's a likelihood that Trump will go back to that approach. And I think that will be disastrous. That will be celebrated by the bloc because as long as it seems to be benefiting Israel, there will be plenty of people in the bloc that will call it a peace deal, as they did with the Abraham Accords, even though the deals were between countries that never had been at war. So I'm not really sure how that qualifies as peace.
We'll have more with Trita after a quick break. Okay, so he talked about being a peacemaker, but in the same speech, he also declared an emergency at the southern border with Mexico, and he said he's going to be taking back the Panama Canal. How does the world square this? Pacifist in one breath, taking over territory in another?
I think the way to understand it is to first recognize it is not because Trump is in any shape or form is a restrainer. I think Trump in many ways is actually an expansionist, perhaps even a neo-imperialist, but has a very different priority sets of what he thinks is important. He does not seem to think that it's particularly important to fight wars in the Middle East because it's not that relevant. But he does see China as a major peer competitor, and he does believe that control of the Arctic, for which Greenland is important, is very important for that. Controlling the Panama Canal, through which, so many ships are going through, including Chinese, is a point of leverage. So he is very much focused on that competition. His opposition to conventional foreign policy is not necessarily that he has been expansionist, it's that it's been expansionist in the wrong directions. And I think a lot of countries around the world are starting to figure out the rhythm of Trump.
Yeah.
It's about reprioritizing rather than necessarily having a fundamentally different approach.
Okay, this might not sound like a foreign policy issue, but what Trump said today about tariffs, I think, has potentially huge ramifications.
Instead of taxing our citizens to enrich other countries, we will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens.
This is absolutely being discussed in every capital around the world right now. What did you make of the tariff section of the speech in terms of its implications for foreign policy?
Well, it obviously will have a very significant implication for foreign policy because a lot of these tariffs are actually going to be imposed against countries that are friends or allies with the United States, not just the friends that are rivals. And that's the other thing about Trump. If you take a look at where he put his priorities in his previous term in terms of where did he really invest diplomatically? Where was he disruptive and where did he try to chart new territory and forge new relations? Well, he put a tremendous amount of political capital trying to, for instance, get a deal with North Korea. He went there, he shook Kim Jong-un's hand, things that no other American president would even want to do because they would view it as politically costly and strategically unworthy. But on the other hand, Trump was very tough against American allies, particularly Europeans, Canadians, etc. And I think this is the pattern we're going to see again. Trump, I think, values getting a deal with Xi. I think he values the ability of him sitting down with Putin. I think he even really desires a deal with Iran. But he's not particularly excited about making a new deal with Germany. So he's being very tough on the countries that have been traditional allies of the United States, viewing them oftentimes as countries that are free riding on the US, while having a bit of a lure, an attraction to the idea of making deals with countries that the United States have been on relatively bad terms with. This is completely the opposite of Biden. Biden, when he talked about diplomacy, he talked about strengthening the alliance system. All of these countries that we're already friends with, we're just going to be more friends with them. Whereas he spends zero political capital on actually resolving tensions with countries that are on the opposite side of the aisle. He made some efforts with Iranians, but it was really a compromised approach. He could have done much better. There was some diplomacy, of course, with Russia prior to Russia's invasion into Ukraine. But the most important variable variable, which was to test and see if the Russians would stop going into Ukraine if NATO membership was taken off the table, was never even tested, never even brought up. So it's not really the exhaustive type of diplomacy I think we need in order to see if we can avoid wars, prevent wars. Trump seems to be the opposite.
Okay, so as we wrap up, given that Trump is so unconventional, does this present opportunities for him to do things on the world stage that perhaps Biden couldn't have or wouldn't have? I mean, you've talked about this a little bit already, but I'm just curious where your head's at, where you're optimistic and where you're worried.
Well, I think precisely because of the unpredictability of Trump, the spectrum of outcomes are massive. It can go all the way from Trump actually getting us into wars to making deals that the previous presidents didn't even dare dreaming about. Those opportunities are there precisely because he doesn't follow convention, precisely because he doesn't listen to the law, precisely because he doesn't want to be a prisoner to the inertia of U.S. Foreign policy bureaucracy. But it also requires a tremendous amount of skills. And that's not necessarily something that we saw in the previous Trump administration. It may be very different this time around. It appears to be a more coherent administration. It appears that he has chosen people not necessarily because of their skills, but because of their loyalty, which at least may address a previous problem he had, which was that he had plenty of people in his own White House who defined their jobs to undermine Trump. So if he wanted to leave Syria, they did everything they could to make sure that the U.S. couldn't leave Syria. This may enable him to actually be more effective in moving in a certain direction. Whether it's done competently or not, of course, remains to be seen. But I think when it comes to the promises here, it really is fascinating. What we're talking about in Washington right now is which is the first deal Trump will strike. Is it going to be Ukraine, Russia? Is it going to be Saudi, Israel? Is it going to be U.S., Iran? I don't recall hearing that type of a conversation when Biden came in last time, that there was a look at some of the toughest issues around the world with the expectation that Trump is going to try to do something to resolve it. Again, whether he succeeds or not is a different story. But there seems to be a strong desire to just throw himself in and see what he can do, precisely because of what he says his most important legacy is to be seen as that peacemaker. Now, if he can succeed in that, so for instance, if he manages to end the war between Russia and Ukraine in somewhat decent terms, if he can do that and at least put an end to the killing. We've already seen a ceasefire in Gaza, which to a very large extent is because Trump finally put pressure on Netanyahu, something that Biden had refused to do for a year and a half. There's a strong desire to make a deal with Iran. The Iranians finally seem to be ready for that. Whether that will succeed or not remains to be seen. But we may actually see variations of these deals within the first year of Trump. And I think that would be next to impossible to expect with not only Biden administration, but most likely with the Harris administration as well, who probably would not have come in with that sense of not even understanding what the concept of political capital is, having zero care for political constraints, a disdain for where the limitations and the obstacles that the law puts forward. That's not the characteristics of what a Biden or a Harris administration would have been.
Trita Parsi, thank you for coming on The Take.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's The Take. If you're short on time but still want to catch the highlights, check out our YouTube Shorts. We post quick clips with the best moments from our episodes that you won't want to miss. It's a great way to stay connected. So check them out, and I will see you tomorrow.